This is Jarvis DeBerry at NOLA.com, here today with Dr. Denese Shervington, a psychiatrist and president and CEO of the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies in New Orleans. We're here to discuss the many disturbing images of violent police interactions with the people they have encountered and what effects the repetition of those images might be having on our psyches. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Shervington.
I'm very honored to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you.
Yeah.
You know, we've seen lots of videos over the last year. There was a video in Ohio of a young man who was holding what amounted to a toy weapon, and the police are called and they come in and shoot him. There's also an image of Walter Scott in South Carolina who is eventually shot dead by the police as he is running away. And even more recently, a couple of weekends ago in Texas, we see this image of a police officer manhandling a young 15-year-old girl. And as I was watching that video in particular, I could feel my heart was pounding. I was having some type of physical reaction to it, not just an emotional reaction to it. And I started wondering how other people might be responding to these same things. Is this a legitimate concern I'm having, worrying about what this might be doing to our minds?
Yeah, totally. After 9/11, if you remember, they took off some of those horrific images of people falling from the towers, because we do know that one can internalize some of those images and personalize. So yeah, there is a possibility that there are people who are developing stress reactions. Unfortunately, the diagnostic and statistical manual that we use as psychiatrists to diagnose mental conditions, it does not allow us to use witnessing horrific images through the media as a criteria by which one could develop post-traumatic stress disorder. I think there's some economic issues connected, but I do think that for communities that have experienced a lot of violence, state-sponsored violence, that continual exposures to these images can create some degree of a stress reaction, and I do believe perhaps even post-traumatic stress disorder.
You know, it occurred to me that throughout history we've seen the government, the state, the police forces, the army, or whatever the case may be, use violence to their benefit to show this is how we will keep you in line, this is how we will patrol you, whether it's public hangings or public whippings or that type of brutality. Of course, that isn't what's happening here. People are using these images in hopes of exposing the state, exposing the government. But I'm wondering if the psychological effects could still be the same, even though the intent is to expose.
I think so, and it's kind of like a side effect of the trying to expose what is going on to hope to get justice. I think one of the negative side effects to that is that for a significant portion of us, who are vulnerable to stress conditions because we come in with a very complex and compounding personal and I'd say cultural history of violence, I think that we can develop acute and perhaps even delayed, and at one time I coined the term a continuous stress disorder. It's like we just keep going from one situation to the next, and I do believe it affects one's psyche. I shared with you earlier that we work with young people, and we are beginning to see that they are developing anxiety and some degree of depression around repeatedly seeing these images of people of color like themselves being killed.
You mentioned the World Trade Center. That's an analogy a friend of mine made this weekend. He said, you know, seeing these images is like seeing those planes fly into the tower over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah, I did not watch the movie United 93, which is about one of those planes, because number one, I know what's going to happen at the end, and it just felt like it was going to be too much for me. There was also a movie Fruitvale Station about Oscar Grant, who was killed by a police officer in Oakland. And I feel like sometimes I want to just have enough with these images. I want to just bury my head in the sand and not even deal with them. But I'm also fearful of being in denial. You know, is that? Explain that for me, because I'm trying to figure it out myself. You know.
Okay. But I do think that when one is faced with horrific, in horrific conditions that are threatening, and I do, again, I'm going to disagree a little bit with the majority of my colleagues or how our profession has defined post-traumatic stress disorder. I think that for some people, I think, are vulnerable to media as a source of the horror. And I do think that what the psyche tends to do, oftentimes it has to distort some of that reality for you to be able to survive the anxiety that happens when one feels that one is being threatened. So oftentimes what we see happen, people dissociate. That happens a lot to women who are victims of sexual violence. There's a degree of dissociation and physical violence. So if you are taking in these media images and personalizing and internalizing, which I think is very legitimate as a male of color, you're not sure that in an interaction with the police that they will see your humanity. I think it's reasonable to try, at least psychologically, to create some defenses. Otherwise, how are you going to make it through the day? If you walk around thinking the police could see me and shoot me, you have to do something. So avoidance and numbing is something that we see in people who are exposed to a lot of trauma.
What are some of the warning signs people may have to let them know that, okay, I may be watching way too much of these kind of images, and what would you recommend for people in that regard?
I think if one finds oneself reliving, kind of wanting to re-experience and keep going after, searching the internet, looking and watching, and I think that's a sign that maybe it's too much. Okay, so there's this bad news, I read this story, we might want to put it aside. We might not want to keep going over and over and replaying those video images. And, I would think, for me, a Buddhist principle that got reinforced for me is that sometimes you have to put some boundaries between your personal experiences and those that are outside of you that you cannot control, and maybe deal with what you can control is yourself, your actions and your reactions.
Are there any special recommendations you would make to parents and how they should talk about this with their children, or whether they should let their children watch these kind of brutal images that are out there or not?
Yeah, of course it's very age dependent. You don't want to expose children who are not capable of some abstractive reasoning and understanding. You just don't want to put them in those images if you can avoid that. But you certainly don't want them to learn by other means. So I think with each developmental stage you have to find the appropriate way to let your children know, especially children of color, that these things are happening around them. But I think for adolescents, that there really needs, as you get older into the adolescent years, that parents really need to have conversations, to sit their adolescents down and say, let's talk about this, how you're feeling, how you're experiencing it, and as a family determine how to manage what is bound to be a psychologically disturbing experience. But I'd say for like your 2-year-old, 3-year-old, you might not want to have these conversations. Yes. I would say up to about 6 or 7. After about 7, you might find some age-appropriate ways, because unfortunately our children are so exposed to the media, and if they're in school, even though it might not be the media in your home, they could be exposed to other kids who have heard this. And so
you told me that you have dealt with some young people who seem more disturbed by the police brutality images they've seen in the media than the ones they may have witnessed or heard about in their own neighborhoods. Can you explain that, or do you have an explanation for that?
I mean, the one thing that I think is perhaps, and what I've seen from I got back to work here after Katrina with the young people, was just a need to numb themselves and almost normalize. I remember there was a murder at Warren Easton, and one of the young men I used to do a weekly support group with these kids, and he very casually, while he had something to eat, said, "Oh, you know, one of my schoolmates got killed today," and I was, you know, this was a good friend of mine. And I had to, after a while, I had to say, let's talk about your feelings about this. But he was willing to go on and had totally normalized. And I think young people have to do that to be able to survive one day after the next. If they, you know, we have a young man whose cousin was shot in the back by the police for no reason other than he said his cousin got scared, saw the cops and ran, and they shot him. And he kind of had to tell himself that maybe his cousin was bad, or maybe his cousin shouldn't have run away. It's really, really hard, I think, for young people to deal with the true reality that if they're of color, that they might be very vulnerable to violence, and in particular if they're males of color.
Well, we could discuss this all day, and I know you could too, but I think that's going to have to be the end of our conversation. Maybe we can talk more about this in the future.
I would be honored.
This has been Jarvis DeBerry of NOLA.com. I'll be chatting about this topic tomorrow at noon at this site. Please send me your questions, comments, and join me for that discussion. Thank you.